Welcome, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our panel of Art History 2060, Imagining Our Futures to Rethink Our Pasts. I'm John Corso-Esquivel, an Associate Professor of Art History at Davidson, and I'd like to welcome you to our second panel of our symposium. Our guest scholars today will continue the efforts our morning panel scholars began by exploring new approaches to the study of art and visual culture. Looking to the future, they consider digital, post-human, and globalized methods with which to consider the art and visual culture of the past. This is the final event in the C3 New Scholars Symposium series, and I'd like to thank the Creating Connections Consortium for providing a generous grant to fund this event. Thanks to Associate Dean and Professor of Anthropology, Heriberto Lozada, Art Department Chair, Court Savage, Professor Shaw Smith, and Professor Rosalind Kyo for peer reviewing the excellent paper proposals we received. Thanks also to Rosalind Posega for expertly handling all arrangements. Thanks so much to Kai Kai Wang, our student intern for this symposium, and thank you to all of my outstanding and supportive art department and Davidson colleagues. About this format, we're going to have 4 presentations this afternoon, and I'm going to introduce everyone all at once. Each panelist is going to deliver their talk from the podium. We will all be masked for the entire event this afternoon, and then we'll reconvene right up here as a group for audience questions and discussions. And we're planning on ending around 3:35. When I woke up this morning, I thought, what a difficult position and a position of privilege it is to be convening an art history symposium while a brutal war is waging in Ukraine and there are conflicts around the world. So I just wanted to acknowledge how important it is that we do have these open panels at a time like this, so that through the free exchange of ideas and difference, we can kind of celebrate in the midst of authoritarian challenges abroad and at home. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Anna Calise is a Visual Arts and Media Studies PhD student from the University Institute for Modern Languages, IULM, in Milan, Italy. Her research focuses on the digitization of museums and the mediatization of the cultural experience. Minne Atairu is an educational doctorate student in art and art education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She holds an MA in museum studies from the George Washington University and a BA in creative arts from the University of Maiduguri in Nigeria. Margaryta Golovchenko is a first-generation Ukrainian immigrant from Toronto or Toronto, Canada. Her research focuses on the representation of human-animal relationships in 18th and 19th century French painting. And Claire Sabitt is a PhD candidate in art and archaeology at Princeton University. She holds an MA from the University of Oregon and a BA from the University of Iowa. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Thanks so much, and please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Anna, and the discussion I'm gonna, I hope to have with you today, it's titled The Digital Museum, an Epistemic Device, because my attempt is to show how museums, when they work online, as they are more and more doing today, are actually shaping the limits of knowledge for how we can experience them as a society. So this is the main question I'm going to discuss around. And here's a little agenda of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start with the premise of museums being very powerful cultural decision makers. Then the question is, so they're working online more and more, and this is a change that hasn't happened for about 500 years. So it's a big change, and is whether the web is actually questioning and changing museum identities. My claim is that we need a map to try to understand these devices, to frame them. And I'm gonna draw from Foucault's theory of the apparatus here and try to design a matrix through which we can analyze the digital museum. And try to understand which are the forces that are at play when digital museums operate. The case study I'm gonna discuss very briefly, it's a very famous case study, is basically as broad as it gets. So my claim is that I'm not looking at something for some specific issues, but the Smithsonian is just very, it's exemplifying many different ways in which we can be digital as museums online, and thus it's helpful. And what are the cultural implications of the choices that museums make today? How can museums actually make a difference in how they operate online? So going from the first point, museums are very old institutions. So the first museum was actually established around the 16th century in Italy, so lucky me. So as you can see, museums have been growing at a, well, not steady pace, actually, you know, very slowly and then very fast throughout the last 500 years, with a very different distribution across the globe and very different focuses in which museums are discussing and built around. But the point is that substantially for this 500 years, museums have been somewhat always the same institution. So what's the definition of a museum? The museums are physical places. They hold collections of objects, and these objects are chosen by societies they are representative of what we as a society value as something that identifies us. And then the point is that this collection of objects, we want it to be accessible in the present, but also in the future for a public. So the idea of collecting, societies have been doing that for way before the first museum was established, but it's when all of this becomes public and accessible and shared as a society that we have the museum showing up. So now museums have been, after 500 years of being almost the same, the past 20, 30 years, they have been existing online. So what I'm defining as the digital museum, of course, we have a lot of technology and digital inside physical museums, but here what I'm analyzing and whatever you can access remotely. So many different things that all together create what is the digital museum. We've probably gone through all of those in different times of our lives, and definitely this is something that has been expanding more in the past 2 years with the pandemic. And what I claim is that something very fundamentally different is happening when museums go online, because before this revolution, we had a physical space that was shaping the way knowledge was showed and was organized. And we had some people curating the museum. So these people may be chosen by public entities or private entities, but the point is that there was a very clear responsibility of who was deciding what was representing a society. But now that we go online, there is no more a physical space. Rooms can be limitless, and there's a very different structure within which content can be thought and valued and organized. And there is a plurality of users. This is very distinctive of the web in general. So we have more people having a say about what is valued and why. So this is a structural revolution, and we kind of have to figure out whether museums are changing in this new space, whether their original paradigm, their identity is changing in this, it can hold, or we want it to hold, or we want it to change. So that's kind of the idea. So how can we draw from theory to kind of make this more concrete and understand how museums work? And my choice was to look at Foucault's theory of the apparatus. Now, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with his work and his theory, but what he says is that when we're looking at a complex object or system, we can look at, if we look at it through his approach, which is defining it as a device or apparatus. This is the English translation. He would say dispositif or dispositif in French. So we can look at it and try to understand. So what does this object try to make visible? What does it show? What does it declare? What is it testifying for the way in which it operates? What kind of power dynamics is it putting in place? And how is it changing? How is it defining its subjectivity through its operation? So my idea is that if we look at museums and try to understand the digital museums, of course, what they're making visible, what they're declaring, what kind of power dynamics they're imposing on society, we can understand better how they're shaping the cognitive possibilities of the future of culture and education. I tried to design a map to understand digital museums, and what kind of came out drawing from what I've been saying up to now is this matrix. So it's kind of a map in which we can have the digital museum inside, and then the horizontal axis goes from the idea of space as it was traditionally thought to a non-space, so the web. And then we can go from the curator to the user. So from a very defined way of choosing knowledge and culture and cultural values to a more user-based and open approach. And this is just to give you an idea. So we can take something that a museum is doing online and we can place it on a different place in the map and decide, okay, so this is actually not proposing anything very much different from what could have been done offline, because it's not embracing the non-space of the web, it's not engaging users, or it's actually doing it. So the point is that going digital is not just enough, it's how we are going digital that makes a difference in the way we are shaping knowledge. Going back to that idea of the power that museums have in creating and establishing what's important and defines the culture of a society. So the case of the Smithsonian, as I was saying, it's a very handy one because it's a huge museum that has within so many different museums, so much different content. It's very committed to digital, and it has been for like 15 years, maybe even a bit more, almost 20. The first things, it's very open access. It's committed on digital, not only on site, but especially to increase accessibility. So it works for the idea of a digital museum and what can be accessed online. So I've decided to look at only, of course, some examples to test the matrix. This is not an exhaustive understanding of the Smithsonian. And we're going to look first at 3 online collections. So the Smithsonian has so many online collections. Here you can see like a list of most of them. This is a first example, the National Anthropological Archives. So this is a very big archive, and to navigate this archive, you kind of need to have some knowledge of what you're looking for, because you have a menu with so many different voices, and then there's, if you look inside culture, there are like 1,000 groups, so many different. So my claim is that to navigate this digital content, you're very anchored to the spatial idea of an archive or how it was thought before the web. And it's very curated. You need to know what you're looking for before you can navigate it. This is another example. It's a bit different in the sense that for the Air and Space Museum, you have way less different categories that you can search through. Actually, the object type and the topic are the only main ones you can use to search. And also you can navigate through images. So in this sense, you could know nothing, and then it's easier to access content. And then this is the collection sampler. So here, there are all different images of all the different museums, all randomly set one next to each other online. In a way, this more remembers what we were discussing today about the art from nowhere with the last discussion. And so this is, it shows a very different special organization of the content. So if we try to put them on the matrix, of course, this is really just, it's not scientific mathematic decimal, but it's more to give you the idea. We can see that the same institution, different content can be organized in very different ways and can take advantage of the digital, yes or no, more or less. Kind of same discussion is with the podcast. I wanted to show you, a few more examples, but the line of thought is almost the same. So many podcasts for the Smithsonian. This is Stories from the Main Street. It's actually a podcast which is co-produced with users and people that have no specific expertise. And the topics are also not very linked on the collection. So it's a very experimental process in the sense. You would think podcasts are not very user-based technologies because they are, you just listen to them. But actually in the production process of this, users were very engaged. Then this is the podcast of the Air and Space Museum. So there are in-depth analysis of a lot of the objects that are inside the museum, but also some researches that the museum is doing. And then there is Side Door, which is a very popular, big, wide series where experts from the museum are asked to discuss in more depth a lot of aspects of the collection. So again, if we try to place this on the matrix, we have different places. So not necessarily this technology takes us more somewhere or somewhere else, but you can use it in ways that can allow you to actually go more towards users and the possibilities of the non-space of the web. And this is the whole cases that we've looked at put together in the matrix. Now, again, this is not, oh, this is how the Smithsonian looks online. Like, you would have to go through so many more cases to make this claim. And my point is not really to make a claim about how the Smithsonian works, but it's about showing that even a very popular museum, which is doing so much for digital, if you then try to look in depth at what they're doing, a lot of their content still is very much curated. Not much is decided together with the users. And I mean, a claim could be made to say, I mean, but should we or should we not? Like, is this do we really have to open up and democratize completely the basis for defining knowledge? What is the stage at which we should engage people? And I mean, I think it's a big discussion, but the point is that I think we should look at the structure of this technology and how they're used in, you know, asking actually these questions and not just going through with it. So I think if we go back to what we were saying with Foucault at the beginning, and actually understanding that museums are very strong institutions in defining what the knowledge of our society is about, we can think about how, you know, the history of museums is definitely not a very horizontal or democratic history. It's a very colonial history. It's a very dominant history. So we actually risk, when we go online, to foster digital cultural colonialism. So the point of rethinking and rediscussing the tools that we use to promote culture online, I think this is it's an incredible moment in which we can actually expand our views and ask the right questions and wonder how we can actually make our society more equal and more accessible and more democratic through the structuring of these tools and how open they are and how they function. So I think there is a lot of space in what museums are doing to just keeping how they've been for the past 500 years, or actually embrace the new possibilities that this specific generational moment is opening up for us. And this is it.
So my presentation is about an artistic project which I began about a year and a half ago. It's titled IGUM, and the actual title of my presentation is Interrupting Benin's Art History Using Artificial Intelligence and Augmented Reality. So my project is an investigation into a 17-year artistic decline in Benin Kingdom. And this artistic decline I define as a period of minimal to no artistic production in Benin Kingdom. And it really means that there is no visual documentation from that period showing art was created during this period. So the project is based on Benin bronzes. And if you have worked into any major art museum in the US or outside the US, you've probably seen a Benin bronze. It's usually located in the African art collection. And we know right now that at least 160 museums worldwide have at least one Benin bronze in their collection. And the term Benin bronzes itself isn't necessarily a reference to the material component of objects in the collection, but it's more an art historical category referring to these objects that were stolen from Benin in 1897. And so we have in the collection, besides these bronze-like looking objects, we have objects made of wood, of brass, of ivory, of coral bead, and all sorts of materials. So for the sake of my project, I'm focusing specifically on objects created with bronze. And even the bronze-like objects most of them are made of brass. Not all of them are made of bronze, so only a handful are actually made of bronze. So if you're unfamiliar with Benin, this is an old map showing the old kingdom of Benin. It's located in the southern part of Nigeria towards the rainforest area. And it's very distinct from the country known as Benin, which is also in West Africa. So Benin, the one I'm referring to in this case, is a region in Nigeria, not the country on the West African coast. And so my project is specifically, I was thinking I use objects that were representative of commemorative heads. They would have typically been used on an altar like this. If you pay attention to the top of the image, it says Juju Altar, King's Palace, Benin City. This is one of the earliest known images of Benin bronzes on an altar in Benin Kingdom. It was taken by Cyril Punch in 1891. So given credit to whom credit is due, Benin bronzes were created by artists who belong to a guild of bronze casters. It's known as Igun Eromwa. And so my project is, of course, drawing the title from Igun Eromwa. So if you're an Igun, you're a bronze caster. Igun Eromwa is a reference to the guild of bronze casters. And prior to the advent of colonialism in Nigeria, or in Benin to be specific, the Guild of Bronze Casters were really monopolized by the king. The king, in the kingdom, you couldn't commission a bronze work without permission from the king. And we know based on evidence right now that only chiefs and other non-hereditary title holders at that time were allowed to produce objects in bronze or bronze-like objects. And so let's move on to how these objects found their way to the West, to Western museums, to any institution you have seen today in the US or outside of the US. So it's 1897, or towards the end of the 20th century. Palm oil is in high demand in Europe at the time for candle making, soap making, margarine production. And on the screen is a factory for Sunlight soap. It's the first soap in Europe that transitioned from making soap with animal fat to making soap with palm oil products, which was again produced in Benin Kingdom. And we see this image also, most of them are most likely palm oil products that were imported from the West African coast. Most likely somewhere from Benin was probably included in this import. And this image again was taken in 1897. This was when Benin was invaded. We don't know yet, or I don't know yet, if it was taken before or after the invasion, but it's really interesting to kind of pay attention to these images, right? And so let's talk about the palm oil production for a little bit. So this is the Oba of Benin, who was the king at the time when Benin was invaded by the British. He monopolized, the king in Benin was considered the head of the kingdom. Everything was centered around him. He literally monopolized every facet of society, from art making to social events and rituals in the kingdom. Everything was about him, right? So in order to do trade with Benin Kingdom, you had to backtrack. He monopolized the markets as well. So he would impose taxes, open and close the markets at whenever he pleased. But again, from the perspective of a capitalist or colonialist, it's very bad to do business with a market that just opens and closes at any time. So over time, the British just decided to invade Benin Kingdom. Long story, you can read it. I know I have only 20 minutes, so I'll rush through. So once Britain invaded Benin Kingdom, the king was deposed, Oba of Aremwe was deposed, and we see again, a lot of chiefs in Benin were hanged because they were blamed for attacking a peaceful delegation, but we know the delegation was not peaceful. It was an armed delegation of about 200 people, 200 British officials who were attempting to persuade the king, in quote, to open markets in Benin. Eventually, the soldiers, Benin warriors, attacked the soldiers, and then only 2 people survived. So we'll see the invasion. Here we have British military officials with Benin bronzes. You can see them if you pay attention to the foreground. You see ivory, bronze-like objects. And then here we see Oba of Aremwe when he was deposed and in exile. If you pay attention to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that he is shackled up. There are chains. His hand is also shackled up, but it's not as visible in this image. Another image showing the looted bronzes about to be shipped off to England. Here we see them. If you pay attention, you'll see stacks and stacks. It's kind of blurry, but if you can make it out, if you pay a little bit of attention to it. Again, an early exhibition of Benin bronzes right after it was looted from the kingdom. This is a letter by W.D. Webster. We know he sold over 600 Benin bronzes. He brokered over 600 Benin bronzes to German museums. Some of those museums are returning Benin bronzes to Nigeria, at least at the end of this year. I am participating in one exhibition where the institution plans to return 176 bronzes by the end of 22, which is great. And again, this is a list by the British Museum curator, who was the first non-military official to receive Benin bronzes when they arrived in England. Here he has a list of Benin plaques, and you can see how it was distributed among various museums. BM stands for museums, and FO for the Foreign Office that was kind of responsible for making it all happen, right? And then if you've read the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, you'll know how colonialism worked. Like the extraction mechanism was that we'll have infrastructure at specific regions on the continent or in the community that allowed for the extraction of resources from that region to Europe. So this is an image of a palm oil factory that was established after the invasion. If you pay attention to the foreground, you see a rail track that goes all the way to the palm oil factory at the end, which typically would allow for the movement of the palm oil product to the dock and off to Europe, which would take us here again, right? So I created an interactive chat to kind of summarize all of this up, because my work is more artistic than it is art historical. I'm an artist. So we have the king at the top. He's the head of the kingdom, in charge of everything. Ceremonies are around him, about him. He really shapes history. And we know he shapes history because a lot of the bronze plaques and bronze heads that we see in museums today are about the king and his conquest. And we see that, right? And this really makes up the bronze making tradition in Benin. And at the bottom of this chart is the bronze casters, who are really responsible for tying all this up together. Without them, we wouldn't have Benin bronzes. Really important that the artists were in the kingdom. So, but then once disruption like this, colonial disruption happens, right? What happens to bronze casters? So we'll go back to this chart again. So we know that the Oba was deposed. I mentioned that, take him out. Right, with that goes ceremonies. We know history also, it kind of shifts from the Benin perspective to a more colonial history. And then with that, we see like the bronze heads, bronze figures, because what Benin artist is gonna cast the bronze of a European? No one. So we'll take that out, and then that affected bronze making tradition that goes to, and so this is where my project really appears, right? If bronze casting at the time was really premised on the fact that the king, on the king's permission, what would you do as a bronze caster? How would you kind of create these impermissible objects? What kind of artistic protocols were you going to use if, you know, for decades and centuries, your predecessors just operated like this, right? So I was thinking of this in relation to critical fabulation. And if you haven't heard about it, it's a term formulated by Saidiya Hartman. She's also a professor at Columbia, but really thinking about how we tell histories that history books cannot tell, right? It's really oriented around these archival investigation, oriented around the grammar of the subjunctive. What could have been, what could have been said? And in the case of my project, what could have been made during this period? And perhaps if we trying to connect it to art history, what kind of art histories could have been told or, you know, been written about Benin, right? So I looked at archives, very interesting to see citations and references to objects created during this period. But again, as I mentioned during my introduction, I haven't really found any visual documentation, no images, no illustrations of objects created specifically during the 17-year period. And there are post-invasion reports that would mention a colonial officer commissioned a Benin bronze during the 17-year period. There's no image. We know a letter was sent to the Oba of Aremwe when he was exiled in Calabar. It was a bronze casted letter. We don't have an image of that. So I was like, okay, I'll make my own. So I started thinking about this in relation to artificial intelligence, because that's what my academic research is focused on. But how does it work, right? So I trained this neural network. It's known as a style GAN. And what happens is you train the style GAN with a data set of images. In my case, I used strictly bronzes that were looted in 1897. So scraping those from museum websites, this is a screenshot of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This is their collection of Benin bronzes, a little preview there. But I also looked at catalogs, early catalogs that had illustrations and rare books that were published at that time. This is my own collection of rare books. I ripped it out to scan the images for my data set. So what we have in the data set is strictly Benin bronzes that were stolen in 1897. But I think one thing that was interesting, and this is unrelated, but I think was interesting to bring up in this setting with art historians, is thinking about art history. In the year 2060, when an art historian in 2060 tries to do research online on a platform as powerful as Google search engine, what kind of results do you get in relation to Benin bronzes? And this was very interesting to see through my research and trying to pull my data set together. So we have Charles Reed, who is the first non-military official to receive Benin bronzes at the time. When he received it, he claimed, or he thought, that Benin bronzes were made by wandering Egyptians. It was of Mediterranean influence. So interesting thing, I'm looking for my data set. I tried to do a Google reverse search on Google, and we see this result that is just like similar to what Charles Reed said like 100 years ago, right? And so much has been said for how, you know, technology just reinforces already existing problems in history, right? And in many ways, this might be justified by engineers as it's semantically related. It's just pulling images that have similar colors, but it also raises question about the idea of a search engine as powerful as Google, but also Benin bronzes, the fact that they're just so highly debated in the cultural world, the fact that a powerful search engine like Google is unable to like distinguish between a Benin bronze and an Egyptian mummy. So that was interesting to see. And then we also go to, when you go to your databases and you're looking for a Benin bronze in the year 2060, given that libraries are kind of like moving from physical spaces to like to digital, right? On a space like Google, whose citation do you see? Whose reference do you see? Whose books do you see? Whose article is listed on Google? And we have Stan Hicks, who I love, but he's up there on the list. And if you kind of continue looking through, and I took the screenshot this morning just to make sure it's updated. If you keep looking through, you don't see any art historian or writer of Benin descent on this list. And if you keep going through the pages, 100 and something pages, top on the list, European authors who in many ways misrepresent or misconstrue, you know, our culture. And we already know that bias, right? So anyway, going to my prototypes. This is an early prototype that I created. It's prototype 2, and it just has like a semblance to an infant, which I thought was interesting to kind of explore themes that were underexplored in the classical corpus. So this looks more like an infant. And then this one was trained on ceramic heads, on terracotta heads. This is what it looks like in a video. Then we see this is my favorite, my most recent one. It was trained with Ile-Ife heads. If you're familiar with Ile-Ife, it is close to Benin. It was very interesting to me to explore this contradiction in our oral tradition. So there's this history that the founder of the Guild of Bronze Casters was a master bronze caster who migrated from Ife to Benin. But then Benin people hold that, oh, it was a master bronze caster who migrated from Benin to Ife. So I was very interested in just exploring that madness, right? So we'll see that if you go back again, you can kind of see how the styles are translated and just mistranslated. But then this is another one also exploring that contradiction in oral history. Ile-Ife, we have Ile-Ife terracotta and Benin terracotta. And this is what it looks like in the video. Another one, you can kind of see more of the Ile-Ife terracotta in this one with the vertical striations from the top to the bottom. So finally, the augmented reality aspect of my work is very much thinking about histories that my own history, so this internal contradiction, right? I was very interested in even questioning my early assumption because in relation to the 70-year artistic absence, these works I'm investigating are Palace Commission works, right? And it's very much about the royalty, about the king, about who has, who's close to the power. But I am from a non-royal family in my family. So that's I put on my researcher hat, right? Understanding reflexivity in this case. I'm from a non-royal family and I'm investigating this Benin bronzes. I don't really have a say in terms of how it is even made. In Benin, only men are allowed to cast in bronze. So in many ways, it's just like I'm coming from a problematic perspective. So to understand that myself, I decided, okay, I can think about critical fabulation differently. How about I start fabulating my own tales and artworks about my people and the kind of works that we created, right, that are not very much represented in museums today. And this is one of them. And this one is an ode to, so there's a title where I come from in Benin. Every female who is born in an odd number sequence, whose birth sequence corresponds to an odd number, is given this like genderless title. It's literally forced upon you. In that way, you're allowed to, attend cults. You're part of cults that are strictly for men. You participate in, events that are strictly for men. So this was an ode to that title. And then we have this one. This is my concluding slide. Another one, it's called the Ikegobo, but this one represents a female. In the royal tradition, we can find much more. Most of them are representative of kings and queens, but this one is for non-royals like myself. So this is my own personal Ikegobo, and it marks like the 1-year anniversary of this project. What an Ikegobo is an altar to the hand. So you're giving thanks to your hand for success and just like, future good things, good luck. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So I am by nature an anxious rambler, so to avoid that and to stick to time, I have a script. In his The Animal That Therefore I Am, which formed part of a 10-hour-long address, French philosopher Jacques Derrida puts forth the infamous scenario. A human, in this case, Derrida himself, is naked in the same room as an animal. In Derrida's case, this is a cat, or his cat specifically. What is the individual to make of their nakedness in the animal's eyes? Should they be ashamed? And if so, what does this say about the animal's ability to comprehend human states of being, or more importantly, our human assumptions about animal comprehension? Derrida's surface question about nakedness gives way to a deeper consideration of the relationship between humans and animals, the latter of which are a subcategory in the broader grouping known as the non-human. Significantly, Derrida's questions are concerned with order as it relates to origin and variation, similarity and difference. And here is one of the kind of fundamental quotes from his text that grounds the rest of his discussion, which is, quote, "If I am following after it, the animal therefore comes before me, earlier than me." It is not the animal then that we should think of as having the definitive perspective. It is not the human then that we should think of as having the definitive perspective around which the concept of being and consciousness is oriented, since the inability to access the animal's perspective fully means that animals will always know and understand more than us. Historically, this marginalization of the animal occurred in a literal and linguistic sense. In the latter case, I am referring to how associations regarding animality have been employed within the discourse of white supremacy as a tactic for othering and dehumanizing groups of human beings, usually people of color, drawing comparisons between a person and an animal in order to strip said person of their humanity. While some areas of the humanities, like literature, philosophy, history of science, and critical race theory, have begun to explore the animal's complex role in the human imagination, the field of art history, when it is concerned purely with visual representation to the detriment of theoretical frameworks, continues to treat animals on par with still life painting, as a detail in the background that can tell us about social, economic, and cultural trends of society, rather than as living beings that deserve acknowledgement and treatment as a subject in their own right. My talk today is more of a roadmap than a finalized paper, and partially me working out ideas that I will explore in my forthcoming dissertation. And I will be charting the shift in Western thought in terms of how the animal has been conceptualized from the Enlightenment period through to today, a moment when animal studies has become its own distinct burgeoning field. As a result, I do not seek to give a definitive answer to this conference's question, which I will reiterate was, how will the discipline of art history be practiced in the year 2060? In part because in order to answer this question requires a process of synthesis and distillation that is currently underway, partially, as I hope, and as I said, in my own dissertation. Instead, I propose starting with what is known before gradually considering what it means to think with the animal and some of the forms and obstacles involved in this process, particularly when re-examining historical artworks using these new frameworks. While contemporary art has increasingly come to focus on human-animal relationships, integrating the theoretical framework of multi-species coexistence into the work from the onset, this task might seem more difficult, if not invasive, when we look when applied retroactively to historical art. Therefore, it is important to emphasize that to look at historical art, particularly paintings such as portraits or genre paintings, which are, just to define them generally, is paintings depicting elements of everyday life. To do so does not mean that the historical painting's meaning is stripped away or being rewritten, that their original social context is buried and forgotten. For this reason, it is helpful to keep in mind Eva Elijah Burchard's discussion of genre painting in her book, The Painter's Touch, where she speaks of the way that, quote, the notion of touch invites activated conception of the work of art, wherein touch is not merely the familiar tactile dimension of the word, but also a reciprocal encounter between the artist and the painting by way of its real life subject, a concept that emerged in the 18th century, but continues to be relevant today. Historical paintings, considering narratives that have previously gone unseen, taken for granted as little more than a decorative feature meant to elevate the human standing. So to guide us on our discussion today, I have chosen the cat as my poster animal, and these are the two specific examples that I will be orienting my discussion around. I have chosen the cat not out of personal preference, and also apologies to any dog people in the room who might not like such a choice. I have more chosen the cat simply because it has been a very captivating animal within the Western imagination, as you have seen both with Derrida and you will see shortly in the rest of my talk. So I have chosen the following two paintings. So Fragonard's Young Woman with a Girl and Marguerite Girard's The Cat's Lunch, which also has an alternative title, which I provided. So an anthropocentric approach to these works would likely begin by focusing on the role of the two women in the painting, partially because they are mediating the viewer's engagement with the cat. The cuddling and feeding invokes a feeling of intimacy familiar to many pet owners, and might even make one long for their beloved feline in cases where there is a prolonged separation between human and their pet. Moreover, the two women might even be said to visually resemble their pets from a technical standpoint. The hair of Fragonard's sitter echoes the swirling texture of the cat she is cradling, less pronounced but nonetheless discernible. Notably, Fragonard's loose brushwork occurs more prominently in the cat than in the girl, to the point where one might not even recognize the creature as a cat prior to reading the title. This is also due to the lack of anatomical accuracy, an inability to distinguish the animal from what appears to be a piece of fabric that the girl is also holding in her hand, which is also a little difficult to make out. Girard's unnamed sitter also physically resembles the cat, namely the similar shade of chestnut brown on both of their heads. However, the primary point of resemblance is their posture. The young lady looks at the plate as intently as the cat does, even though it is the cat that is partaking in the meal. The two are united in their concentration, and it is only the dog that seems to not have a place in this painting that is very clearly assigned, clearly interested in assigning roles to all the members in the composition. One could say that Fragonard's female subject is eroticized, her curved neck tantalizing the viewer, but denying them the attention and affection, instead directing them at the cat. By comparison, Girard's female subject is an unnamed woman who performs her duties as a good housekeeper and pet owner by feeding the cat. Continuing down this anthropocentric path, one might then consider how this difference of the treatment of the female subject might be explained by the different genders of the two artists who further research would reveal actually have a personal connection to each other. Namely that Girard was Fragonard's sister-in-law, and then she eventually studied under him. Questions about the cats, such as what their breed is, are a good starting point in that they recognize the animal's presence. However, these questions run the risk of limiting themselves to the human sphere of interest, especially when it comes to pets, which are chosen based on what is desirable or convenient for the human being, which is why a lot of more informed pet owners will look at, for example, how friendly is a cat, how much care does it require, does it shed, is it hyperallergenic, things like that. And then they make their choices of what kind of cat to get based on those different categories. To prod the question of representation, so in this case, what I mean is the difference in representation merely the case of stylistic difference, or can it be considered an indicator of a changing relationship with the animal? Such questions move us away from the preoccupation with verisimilitude and towards a discussion of the animal as a being, as a sitter in its own right. The connection between women and cats fascinated Enlightenment philosophers, partly because the cat went against the idea that animals lack agency and merely respond to humans without possessing any consciousness, any conscious thought process of their own. And perhaps the most famous proponent of such an idea is the philosopher René Descartes, who argued that animals were no more than automata, and that, I quote, if there were such machines having the organs and the shape of a monkey or of some other animal that lacked reason, we would have no way of recognizing that they were not entirely of the same nature as these animals. Whereas if there were any such machines that bore a resemblance to our bodies, meaning the human body, and imitated our actions as far as this is practically feasible, we would always have two very certain means of recognizing that they were not at all, for that reason, true men. And a famous example, or one that I would recommend looking at, is much later, but is E.T.A. Hoffman's novel, The Sandman, which specifically is about this female automata, Olympia, who so upsets the protagonist when he finds out that this is not a real woman, but rather a machine, that it leads him to have a mental breakdown. So according to Descartes, animals do not have souls and cannot feel pain because they lack the language and consciousness needed to articulate such a sensation. And for this reason, Enlightenment figures like the Comte de Buffon, a French naturalist best known for his encyclopedic work Histoire naturelle, in which he sought to catalog and describe all of natural history, in which he did not succeed in doing before he died, were taken aback by the cat. Buffon referred to cats, and these are all quotes kind of strung together. So he refers to cats as, quote, the genus of cruel and rapacious animals, that they are, quote, all destructive, ferocious, and untamable. And he includes the domestic cat in these discussions as well, who he describes as, though reduced to slavery, is neither less perfidious nor more obedient. So the cat's resistance to being trained is what led to them being associated with women who were considered equally wayward and in need of a man's strong hand. From such a historical perspective, paintings like Fragonard and Girard's are as much an attempt to normalize the emerging practice of pet keeping, particularly as it relates to women, as they are efforts to locate the animal in the human world, given its increased presence. And more on this topic, I would recommend the article by Jennifer Milan, where she actually talks about how the relationship specifically between women and their pets, especially lap dogs or other small animals, was actually sexualized and seen as a sexual threat to men. And there were jokes, misogynistic jokes that were made about how women were sleeping with their animals and their lovers and husbands were going neglected and unloved. So it's a brilliant article that, if you are interested on the topic, highly recommend, based on my current research. So at this point in time, historically, the animal has not entered the stage of intimate relations with the human because it is still kept at the threshold of being, marked by its mystery and difference. If philosophy of the past sought to understand the animal as distinctly different from the human, then contemporary discourses have shifted their approach to examining the relationship between humans and animals and focusing more on the nature of the bond than on the biological difference between the two parties. Derrida, with whom I opened my presentation, continues the philosophical line of inquiry preoccupied with what it means to be the animal and how these two worldviews, so the human and the animal, can exist side by side. However, there is a heightened emphasis on intimacy in his discussion. And this intimacy is not merely the kind experienced from close physical contact to the animal, which we see evidence of in the two paintings on the screen. Instead, it is a self-reflexive inquiry about what it means to bear oneself before another creature that is capable of understanding, to varying extents, our human existence and to evaluate it. Derrida refers to this as, quote, the passion of the animal, my passion of the animal, my passion of the animal other, seeing oneself naked under the gaze behind which there remains a bottomlessness, at the same time innocent and cruel perhaps sensitive and impassive, good and bad, uninterpretable, unreadable, undecipherable, abyssal and secret, end quote. What characterizes the present discourse about animals, therefore, is a focus on the deeper emotional commitment that human-animal relationships require. It recognizes the animal as a participant who is equally capable of maintaining and, more importantly, breaking the relationship. The question, in other words, becomes a matter of agency. If we look at the Fragonard and Girard paintings from this angle, the cats are not merely extensions of art objects, by which I mean inanimates purchased for aesthetic goals akin to that of home decor, which you put in your home and then you don't think about anymore because you've achieved your primary goal, you've acquired it, and that's it. The cats respond to their surroundings, their human companions, recognize linguistic cues, and develop preferences for certain spots within the domestic space, often claiming them as their own. They are what Donna Haraway refers to as, quote, companion species, a bigger and more heterogeneous category than companion animal, and not just because one must include organic objects, include such organic beings as rice, bees, tulips, and intestinal flora, all of whom make life for humans what it is, and vice versa. More radical thinkers call for a rethinking of how we refer to the animal altogether, a call that once again can be found in Derrida, who proclaims, quote, I would like to have the plural animals heard in the singular. There is no animal in the general singular, separated from man by a single indivisible limit, end quote. To address the problem of language is to move towards the post-human goal of challenging what it means to be human and how the human relates to the world. One step towards this goal would be to acknowledge that other non-human points of view are equally valid. According to a post-humanist view, we can learn much about the world if we were to simply decenter our current anthropocentric perspective. However, anthropocentrism is at the heart of the issue of language, as scholar Timothy Morton points out in their book, Humankind, Solidarity with Non-Human People, where they state that, quote, there is no pronoun entirely suitable to describe ecological beings. The familiar pronouns I, you, and he/she are all guilty of framing non-humans like animals in relation to the human, as either different or as similar, but in a reductive sense, whereas it objectifies, refusing to engage in the kind of equal level relationality that I mentioned before. Additionally, it signals our recognition that, like humans, animals possess sex, although we cannot always determine this information visually. This is certainly the case with the Fragonard and the Girard paintings, where the sex of the animals might be inferred from things like the physical proximity between the human and the animal, and the latter's behavior in response to this intimacy, or even simply the cat's size. Rosé Braidotti discusses this type of reading into of the animal in her book, The Posthuman, where she notes, quote, animals have long spelled out the social grammar of virtues and moral distinctions for the benefits of humans. This normative function was canonized in moral glossaries and cognitive bestiaries that turned animals into metaphorical referents for norms and values. In other words, animals have and continue to be treated as a medium for communication, signs in a network of meaning that are not the endpoint of human focus. To look at the Fragonard and Girard paintings while keeping contemporary discourses in mind would require asking, first and foremost, about systems of care. What were the conditions that brought the human and the animal in contact with each other and shaped their interaction to the point where today people are divided into cat person and dog person? Amy Franz and Michael Yonan detail this history using the rare cat breed in France known as Chartreux. And this history is bound up in trade relations and when it comes to other animals such as parrots and monkeys and colonial networks as well. However, such historical facts belie an element of speculation that is inescapable. I acknowledge that we can never fully know the animal, just as we can never know each other fully or have a truly objective account of human history, for the voice of the animal has not and cannot be recorded by such scholarly methods, nor can such animals record their histories in a way that is accessible to humans, if they would even want to do so. Where then do we go next? What is the future of thinking about animals? There have been radical proposals to this question, perhaps most recently by Patricia McCormack in her book, The A-Human Manifesto, which asserts that the best way for non-human beings like animals to speak is for humans to stop reproducing willingly and eventually go extinct. When this happens, according to McCormack, animals and their non-human cousins will be able to speak and be heard. Less radical, but perhaps more constructive to push fields like art history forward is Donna Haraway's idea of kin making in her aptly titled book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kill in the Chulucine, which can serve as a framework for rethinking existing forms of relationality with the animal. Kin making, according to Haraway, is characterized by the fact that the relationship is not defined by biological lineage. These oddkin, as Haraway refers to them, are bound not by familial obligation, but by a sustained desire to maintain the relationship. Such a relationship is not considered beneficial from a capitalist perspective, given that the system is characterized by the constant need and emphasis on gain. A different way to think about this is using Lee Edelman's critique of what he calls reproductive futurism in his book, No Future, in which he challenges the heteronormative preoccupation with reproduction and lineage, since it leaves no room for clear conceptions of the future, of what it means to be successful and fulfill one's goals as a human individual. This is the reason why, as discussed earlier, historical fact can only get us so far. It may give us the physical and economical or even the personal means by which the animal came to be in a specific geographical location. However, it can never give us the rationale for why such animals chose to stay once nothing was standing in their way of leaving. The challenge with this statement, we must think with the animal rather than for it, is that it begs the question of implementation. This is where I will conclude my talk. How does one challenge this goal and avoid the risk of it remaining little more than a hypothetical, a speculative reality that is an unachievable ideal? One of the ways to do this is by acknowledging that our current understanding of the animal hinges on the power dynamic that has been cultivated through settler capitalist worldview, fueled by liberal humanism. Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang's article titled Decolonization is Not a Metaphor argues for the abolition of land ownership, highlighting the ways that land itself, rather than any form of currency you may carry, is the true wealth of the settler capitalist mind. This argument can be extended to include animals, whom we also tend to think of as existing for the purpose of fulfilling our emotional and economical desires, as well as liberal humanist notions of manifest destiny, which seek to catalog and claim the world for ourselves. The future of the animal, therefore, is an extension of a decolonialized future. In this context, the animal is not treated as a mysterious being in need of being decoded and known based on human abilities. Rather, the animal becomes an equal in our embrace of an unknowable and therefore untamable world. Thank you.
Okay, so the talk I'm giving today is something that was born out of a graduate seminar that I took about global art history and world art history, sort of questioning methods of what to do with art history in moments of globalization. It was a very long paper, which I've tried to condense, so I also have a script. Between the 15th and 16th centuries, the European world map experienced a massive transformation.
No longer did the TO map of the Middle Ages or the Jerusalem-centric model adequately represent the contemporary understanding of the wider world. Following the European expeditions to the Americas and around the Cape of Good Hope, and the renewed interest in Ptolemaic theory, maps became more standardized than they previously had been. With the advent of projections, the question of how to represent a three-dimensional world in a two-dimensional form could be made intelligible to a pan-European audience. The radical reimagining of what the world looked like, together with the widespread establishment of the printing press throughout Europe, meant that depictions of the wider world were more possible and in higher demand than ever before. One type of image not typically associated with the early modern notion of the global is costume books. And here I'm showing a frontispiece from one that I won't have time to talk about today, but I just wanted to show it. And for reference in my captions throughout this presentation, when I include locations, those are locations of publication, not where this print is today. While costume books already existed in manuscript form, the genre of printed costume books of people of the world exploded in the 16th century in Italy, France, the Low Countries, and Germany over the course of a mere 50 years. I would like to suggest that not only should costume books be read directly alongside other cartographic imagery, but that such images can offer a way to fundamentally reimagine how the discipline of art history, particularly with regards to the early modern period, deals with so-called popular prints. A closer examination of these reproducible and relatively inexpensive books and prints can open further discussions of colonialism, globalization, and nationalism, as well as book history and material culture that would otherwise be obscured by traditional canons. To begin, I would like to first turn to the historical and historiographical impetus behind the notion of early modern global geography. The seminal Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt famously characterized the early modern period by, among other things, the discovery of the world, and more specifically, quote, the discovery of the outward universe and to the representation of it in speech and in form, end quote. While Svetlana Alpers coined the phrase the mapping impulse in relation to 17th century Dutch art, she also noted that the general connection between image making and maps can be traced back to Ptolemy's geography. The connection between cartographic imagery and Ptolemy was seated as early as the 13th to early 14th century, when the ancient work was rediscovered in Europe, though Muslim cartographers engaged with his text as early as the 9th century. The text was translated from Latin to Greek in 1406 and spread via print across Europe. The so-called Ptolemaic Revolution radically altered the ways in which cartographic spaces were represented and understood. More recently, Sean Roberts argued that geographers were responsible for, quote, integrating word and image and accurately and adequately describing the world, end quote. He went on to state that geographers were understood to be broadly proficient in both verbal and graphic skill, arguing that what he refers to as a geographic culture of the late 15th and early 16th centuries was shaped by the revival of Ptolemy. This Ptolemaic connection appears in the work of Giorgio Vasari, who referred to the map cycle of the Guardaroba Nuova, which you see here, as the tables of Ptolemy, despite their divergence from Ptolemaic theory. Vasari's reference to the geography suggests that by the mid-16th century, early modern maps were inseparable from the ancient geography, and that the Renaissance idea of geography was deeply intertwined with the reception of Ptolemy. Scholars of cartography further note the difference between large map cycles, such as those that we see here, or in the perhaps more well-known Vatican Hall of Maps, and printed popular imagery, which were also expected to describe the history, biology, ethnography, and topographical information. This process of mapping moved well beyond surveys and entailed highly specific information about places to be depicted. The scope of public engagement in this culture of cartography as it developed in the 15th and 16th centuries is demonstrated by the extent of materials formally published at the time. So here, this is one map which survives in many different editions in museums and collections today. It is estimated that in 1500, there were approximately 60,000 individual map sheets in circulation, while by 1600, that number reached 5,500 different maps. Assuming each of these maps were printed in editions of around 250, we can estimate that there were over 1.3 million individual map sheets, over 20 times as many as only 100 years earlier. This does not account for travel logs, city views, atlases, and costume books. It is not difficult to imagine the truly monumental scale of cartographic prints in circulation during the 16th century. Surviving inventories from print shops also speak to the relationship of printed maps to the larger print market in the early modern period. For example, the 1528 inventory of the Rosselli shop in Florence listed 58 maps, including this one, half of which were world maps. However, this accounted for less than 5% of the shop's total inventory of prints. Unfortunately, the scarcity of such images or such inventories has resulted in many different estimates of the popularity of maps as opposed to other prints within the larger art market. In relation to the number of other prints sold at the time, some have generously estimated that maps accounted for as much as 10% of all single sheets in circulation. The importance of map trade is also supported by the fact that the Rosselli shop was said to have a large round world map as a sign outside of the shop. Cartography was part and parcel to the early modern print market, literally serving as the shop's insignia, despite the fact that maps occupied a relatively low percentage of their overall inventory. I'd like to now turn to the printed costume books to better understand how they can be read as evidence of and actors in this culture of cartography. The first known printed costume book was created by Enea Vico. The significance of this particular costume book has generally been understudied, perhaps because complete bound copies of the book do not survive today. Instead, the plates survive as single sheets, and several are only known because they were later copied by the Venetian artist Ferdinando Bertelli in his 1563 costume book. However, early modern readers were likely aware of Vico's book, indicated by the fact that Giorgio Vasari made it a point of discussing the work in his 1568 edition of the Vitae. Vasari recounted the book as including 50 depictions of people from diverse nations, including Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, England, Flanders, and other parts of the world. So a closer look at Vico's prints begs the question of whether this was truly an attempt to depict the global in the same manner as later works. While, for example, he depicts people from Spain, which you can see here, an emerging concern is the social status of figures. Several plates of Spanish peasants accompany images of people in more ornate, costly costumes. His plates of foreigners include people from Africa, the Tartary, and the Ottoman Empire. Nowhere does he include images of people from the Americas or East Asia. The use of the term Tartary reveals what was either a lack of understanding or the general lack of concern with specificity of language used to describe vast areas of Asia. Later costume books, such as Cesare Vecellio's 1590 publication, explicitly include men and women from Japan and China and label them as such. Such a change might indicate that there was an increase in the demand for knowledge of East Asia, and possibly that more information about distant lands had become accessible to European printmakers over a period of roughly 30 years. Whatever the reason was, it is clear that this early published costume book made no real attempts to move beyond the confines of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Vico's depictions of foreigners also display some distinct issues about gender. He included 3 depictions of women from Africa, but no men. The 3 plates are differentiated by the marital status of the women: a virgin, a married woman, and a widow. The reasons behind this are not easily discernible. It is possible that Vico simply had not seen drawings of other images of African men, though this seems unlikely in the print center of Venice. By 1598, costume books had become increasingly more specific in their terminology related to faraway places. Vecellio's 1590 book is certainly one of the longest and most comprehensive printed costume books, and included several dozen plates depicting figures from Africa. Vitellius plates carried much more specific inscriptions than Vico's, such as a noble Moor from Cairo, an Ethiopian soldier, nobles from the Barbary coast, as well as a few plates of just Africans. This shift towards a wider variety of people from more distant lands suggests that 16th century readers were actively interested in more specific information about places outside of Europe. Depictions of so-called exotic populations became essential components of costume books, expanding the notion of the whole world in a highly regimented way. While depictions of distant populations remained an essential component of the costume book, these depictions were always subordinate to those of European populations. Images of figures from Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Ottoman Empire always appeared after the depictions of Europeans, and the plates were nearly always fewer in number than the number of plates dedicated to European costume. The only exception to this rule was the relatively rare subgenre dedicating an entire costume book to one specific place, such as the Ottoman Empire or China. Vico's depictions of Ottomans are only known through later copies by Bertelli, which you can see here, but Bertelli's plates continue the idea that individuality of the figures was entirely unimportant. One potent example of this is seen here. This is a folio now in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, and it has been identified as Turkish costume by Bronwyn Wilson. The figure turns away from the viewer, effectively making costume the only recognizable feature in the image. The social status or facial features were apparently not of interest, creating a sense of mystery that could enforce preconceived notions about Ottoman Turks as deceitful. This idea was already propagated in the extensive pamphlets and other political propaganda circulating around moments of warfare between Venice and the Ottomans, as well as material published in Northern Europe during the Habsburg clashes with the Ottoman Empire. This exaggerated implication of alterity can be read as a moment when costume books reinforce stereotypical ideas about distant places. This demands a reconsideration of what costume books that allegedly depicted populations of the whole world were really doing. Such biases continued to appear even in costume books that made explicit claims on being based on eyewitness accounts. When Nicolas de Nicolai published a costume book comprised of many depictions of Turkish figures in Antwerp in 1567, he specified in his prologue that he was an authority on the topic, having spent 15 years in Istanbul accompanying the French ambassador. The plates range from relatively detailed images of richly patterned robes, such as the image on the right, to the portrayal of a dervish man, a relatively marginal sect of Sufi Muslims, which he called pious Turks in his text. Nicolai's readers would have then come away with the idea that to be pious was synonymous with masochism and horror. The figure portrayed is shown in ragged furs, with bare feet, grimacing while he inflicts wounds on himself. Other plates in his series depict soldiers, prostitutes, janissaries, and peasants, as well as nobles and merchants, offering his readers the idea that he was truly representing all types of figures from Turkish society. The popularity of this particular book is apparent based on the fact that it was translated from its original Dutch into German, English, French, Latin, and Italian within only 30 years. Was this a result of his implied claim to have personally drawn all the figures from life? Or was it a result of the overly dramatic, terror-inducing ideas he portrayed? Perhaps the answer was both. Whatever the case may be, the biases and images of foreign populations were potent. Costume books, in many ways, moved well beyond the capabilities of maps. They told you where these horrors and curiosities could be found, and essentially could give a reader an idea of what to expect should they desire to go to one of these places. Or they could simply thrill the readers with the idea that they could get a sense of what it was like to go to these places without ever leaving the confines of their hometown. The idea of costume books as indicative of a population's character continued in other 16th century costume books, also through the inclusion of inscriptions or poems to accompany the images. For example, here in Joost Ammen's depiction of a Turkish prostitute, a common figure found in several costume books, the inscription reads, This is a prostitute who sells her impure body for dirty money to a lover that pleases her. With the earnings of this sin, she dresses herself prettily and beautifully in order to attract the Turks even more easily with her false ornaments, end quote. Her costume was thus morally corrupt, as was her character as a result of her profession. According to the use of words like filthy, dirty, and sin here, we might also read the image making in the early modern costume book as a mechanism of control. Readers were presented with a depiction of foreign people as either good or bad, rich or poor, pious or sinful. Whether or not the information portrayed could be substantiated did not really enter the lexicon. These books were regimented, entertaining depictions of the idea of what distant populations looked like, how they acted, and what cultural customs they participated in. While it is not clear why the latter half of the 16th century was the precise moment that saw the sudden arrival of many printed costume books, the books as a genre can be connected to each other by their organization around geography and social status, and by their continued Eurocentric emphases, suggesting that they were driven by what we might call armchair travel. In 1531, the English diplomat Sir Thomas Elyot wrote about the exploration of the wider world, looking at images, the exploration of the wider world through reading, looking at images and collecting, in order to, quote, behold in his own house everything that within all the world is contained, end quote. This ability to experience the wider world from afar had been made possible by the earlier crusades in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as the aforementioned colonial expansions. While costume books might have purported to depict global populations, their reliability is dubious at best. But credibility seems to be fairly unimportant. The most lengthy costume book is Vecellio's from 1598, which has long been known to have many plates based on earlier images, not on observation. While Burckhardt claims that geographic depictions in images were only achievements when based on observation or evidence of the eyewitness, costume books offer a challenge. Perhaps accuracy based on direct observations did not really matter after all. It was simply about the illusion of accuracy. In his foreword to the 1581 costume book printed in Cologne, Caspar Rutz stated that his book was useful because while many books depicted places around the world in images and in maps, his book showed quite, quote, human dress according to the usage of the individual people, and in that way it can be easily seen not only how one region differs from another, but also in which way the inhabitants and people differ, end quote. In his view, costume books offered critical information about the world that was not conveyed by other cartographic material. In 1589, the English writer Richard Hakluyt advised that should one desire to travel abroad, one should be prepared with a few different types of books, including herbals and costume books. In Hakluyt's view, costume books could similarly inspire awe in indigenous populations abroad. Not only were they tools for travelers, but they could apparently act as a kind of social currency abroad. While maps allowed one to travel the globe, costume books could give readers a sense of truly knowing a place vis-a-vis images of the people who lived there. Their publication must then be read as what Aisha Ramachandran has called world making, or the process of understanding and crafting a certain image of the wider world and Europe's place within it. Their appearance at the moment of the expansion of maps and city views, combined with the increased popularity of travel accounts, meant that they never operated independently. They were relatively inexpensive compared to their manuscript counterparts and were frequently written or translated into vernacular languages. Though these books claim to depict people of the whole world, it is more accurate to say that they showed foreign populations in terms of social status or moral messages. They appear on blank backgrounds as if plucked out of a recognizable context, giving readers a sense of what a distant place was like through costume plates and text alone. Perhaps then it is not surprising that ideas of extravagance, hedonism, and violence abound. What began as a node of Ptolemaic revolution developed into a malleable way to entertain, a goal naturally subject to distortions of facts and the blurring of observations. While the culture of photography clearly circled around the idea of recording distant places, costume books demand a reconsideration of the motivations behind this. Truthful accounts could be just as important as the overly dramatized, even fictional ones. To conclude, I would like to suggest that reconsidering the early modern period from the context of so-called popular prints, such as costume books, is one way that the discipline of art history can move beyond traditional canons. Images previously seen as subsidiary models for later artists, such as costume plates, can be read as critical constructions in their own right. Integrating contemporary notions of alterity and Eurocentricity, as well as interrogating travel literature and other accessible books as crucial aspects of the early modern art market, offer new ways to approach tangible experiences of what it was really like to see 16th century images in the 16th century. While research on the print market of Renaissance Europe still presents many unknowns in terms of distribution, reception, literacy, and copying, among other issues, it is hoped that the present project has offered some ways in which one prominent aspect of the world of print, or this cartographic genre, sheds light on the demand for and circulation of popular prints.